Okay, well, welcome this evening. There is a particular book that has a fantastic name that I've been reading about this house. It called it The Best Address in Town, here 14 Henrietta Street. And it really is the best address in town, especially in those days. And I will be explaining why tonight. If we think back to the 18th to 19th century, it was a little bit of a different story. But I'm really, really interested in the period before that, Georgian Dublin, and what 14 Henrietta Street was like. You'll see in my PowerPoint this evening a lot of technical words about architecture. Please don't worry about those. I'm going to try and use plain English this evening. If we have a chance for questions and answers later on, you can certainly ask me anything you want about the content. And if we're ready to go, I'll start. As you can see, I'm using a sign language interpreter here tonight. And that is for the use of everyone, not just me. Obviously, if you don't understand Irish Sign Language, you need the interpreter to understand me. Also, I might not be able to understand your questions without the interpreter. So it really does go both ways, okay? Where am I? Okay, so Georgian Dublin. Now in the year 2024, we know that there's a lot of evidence from Georgian Dublin still around. If you look at this picture here, this is a picture painted in Georgian times by James Moulton. And I prefer to use his pictures of life in Georgian Dublin. And I'll explain what these pictures are about. This is Capel Street. This is going over the bridge here, and you can see at the very, very end, we've got Parliament Street in the background there. You can see City Hall there, the dome and the portico there, and you can see then either side of Capel Street leading up to it, you can see the horse-drawn carriages, people from all walks of life standing and walking around the street, the poor, the rich, soldiers, sailors, and so on. This picture shows it all. And in Georgian Dublin, you might think to yourself, what are the characteristics of Georgian houses, of architecture? Well, one thing about Georgian architecture is you have very symmetrical buildings. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while, and I'll show you what I mean in pictures. But you've got very symmetrical houses, very similar looking houses. You've got places like Merrion Square, Fitzwilliam Square, Mountjoy Square, very iconic parts of Georgian Dublin. These squares in the middle of an urban area with terraces of fine houses all around them. And those squares were garden squares accessible to those who lived in the houses. So the actual time span of Georgian Dublin and the name Georgian Dublin, where does that come from? Well, the span goes from 1714 to around about 1830. That's the period that we call Georgian, because of the fact that King George I, the second, the third, and the fourth were kings of England at the time. So that's why we use this phrase Georgian Dublin, the Georgian era, and so on. It's all based upon the British kings at the time. Now, before this time, Dublin was quite a cramped city. The medieval winding streets, buildings on top of each other and in a state of disrepair. You had to shoulder your way through these narrow streets among the throngs of people. But then, in the early 1720s, it was decided that Dublin needed to be improved. We needed a cleaner, tidier, more orderly city. Some of these buildings that were very higgledy-piggledy needed to be knocked down, and new, finer ones erected in their place. And one of the earliest streets that were built in this time was Henrietta Street. And this is one of the finest examples of Georgian architecture that we still have today in this street. Georgian Dublin is a very important, fundamental part of Dublin culture and heritage. A lot of people come and visit. Yeah, no, you can come in, it's fine. A lot of people will come to visit Dublin specifically to look at the architecture, at these Georgian beautiful buildings, and they are fantastic. I mean, a little bit biased when I say that, but I do think they're beautiful. And Henrietta Street is still a place where people live in these buildings. It's still residential to a certain extent. It's not just museums or office buildings, even though we do have those. We also have people who still live here. So I want to give a little bit of background and talk more about Henrietta Street specifically. How did Henrietta Street reflect Georgian Dublin as a whole? Is everything okay? Does anyone have any questions at this point? Is everyone clear? Great. Now, this is an example of the technical language that I was hoping to avoid this evening. Don't worry too much about these terms. I will explain it in, I suppose, simpler English. Yeah, come on in. So I'll talk about the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis here. The thesis, I suppose, is step one when you're talking about the development of this architectural style. So if you think of medieval Dublin, the kinds of buildings, the very thick walls, Dublin Castle will be a good example of some of this kind of architecture. You know the big round tower in Dublin Castle? That's an example of that medieval type of architecture from that period. And buildings were constructed at that time out of stone, always with a view to defence. There were defensive structures. Now, Ireland wasn't really, I suppose when we're talking about step two, this antithesis, a lot of people would look at this medieval architecture in Dublin and say, this isn't sufficient for Dublin in this time. We need something fresh. We need something that looks to the future, a new kind of architecture. We need something different. And at the time, you had the Renaissance happening in places like Italy and the continent, and developments in architecture there. If we have a look at architecture during the Renaissance, there was always a harking back to Greco-Roman times, classical features of architecture. You see that in the buildings and the style, the columns, the pediments and porticos of the time. So Greek and Rome classical buildings, you do see coming back those styles in the Renaissance. So going back to Dublin and this step one, this thesis, this medieval architecture. There was an attempt in this step two to take what was good about this new movement of architecture and get rid of the old medieval architecture that wasn't working. But at the same time, it also took some of the best of both worlds and blended these two types of architecture into a new fashion, a new format. And so then we talk about Georgian architecture being the best of both worlds. It's plain, clean lines. It uses, for example, classical features in its architecture. But it's not too busy. It's a little bit understated. It's not so much in your face in its decoration, but it aims at uniformity and order. And it's also used to show the wealth of the people who build and own these buildings. The aim of architecture in Georgian Dublin at the time was for Dublin to become far more orderly, for the centre of the city to be more planned out. So urban planning, wider streets, uniformity of buildings on either side. And you can see outside in Henrietta Street, there's quite a large setback there. So the streets are very wide. The Wide Streets Commission now came later on, if you're familiar with that. But for now, just be aware that the street in Henrietta Street is very wide and the setback also is considerable. Any questions at this stage? Okay. So we have three pictures here that I'll go through and explain what I mean. This is Dublin Castle on the right here. It's the oldest of the three. I think this represents the thesis, but then we also have the antithesis and then the two coming together in a synthesis. So we have our example of medieval architecture, Dublin Castle. We have the Renaissance style of architecture as our antithesis, and then the synthesis is what we see coming out in the architecture in Georgian Dublin. And if you go to Dublin Castle, you'll actually see a mishmash of those three kinds of buildings. This building in the middle here, there's a row of Georgian houses in Dublin. This is a picture of it. You can see it stretching quite far up here into the left corner. The windows are very uniform. There's very little variety between the buildings. A little, but not too much. It's very understated. And that's where buses pass now every single day. This is a picture actually from the 20th century, and it's not exactly up to date, but you can see the buses here are slightly different from what we're used to today. Say maybe it's the early 21st century. So you've got medieval Dublin, you've got very late 20th century Dublin, and this picture here on the left, this shows the River Liffey, the road beside it, as it would look in Georgian times, and you can see the mixture of the medieval city there, as well as the features of Georgian architecture, the columns and the domes and so on. Okay? So we can see that there are differences between the houses in Henrietta Street. They're not uniform. So how does that synthesis idea, this mixture of styles, apply to Henrietta Street just outside? How does it take from both those traditions of architecture? Well, you've got things like proportion, symmetry. So you can see that the houses are very symmetrical in the way they're laid out. And you've also got this Palladian influence. And I suppose Palladian is a style of architecture that comes from Italy during the Renaissance. And you can see that in Henrietta Street as well. The windows in the buildings on the street are noticeable because maybe the photograph isn't clear enough, but I will have other pictures that show a clearer view. And you can look outside yourselves later on. Have a look at the doors in the buildings in this street and have a look above the doors. There's a hemisphere shape that you'll often see, like a fan light, and there's often a portico or kind of a small porch where the doors are, the front doors of this building. So these porticos are definitely a feature of this Georgian time. It's a modern term, I suppose. It's kind of a porch. Some of them will have a triangular pediment above them, some will have a semicircle or a hemisphere, some will have columns outside. And the windows are very mathematically precise if you think about it. They're very evenly laid out. So the entrance to these houses, really the houses in this time were all about comfort. This domestic comfort. Now, it's a little bit misleading because the elite at the time wanted to show off their wealth in these houses, their power. The luxury that they had, their separation from the riffraff in the 1720s, 30s and 40s, and there were plenty of riffraff around, people like myself maybe at the time, they wanted to keep them at a distance. The lords and ladies, like you can see this picture here at the back of the room here on the left, this was a leading aristocrat during the 18th century, and he's pointing towards his horse there, you can see in the picture. So that's Lord Molesworth. We have another picture on the other side of the room. That was his second wife, a lady here. And both of them were very highly ensconced in elite society at the time in the 18th century. More information about these two characters, by the way, is available in the museum on the tour here in 14 Henrietta Street if you'd like. So that's the kind of person that would occupy these houses at the time. Any questions so far? Okay. So, the planning and construction of Henrietta Street. We do have to think about the historical background to this. Before the 1720s, this whole area was really, I suppose you could say, it was marshland. It wasn't developed. It was owned by the Archbishop of the Church of Ireland, the Archbishop of Dublin. His name is Bolter. Apologies. And the Archbishop, when it came to the 1720s, asked a man named Luke Gardner and a colleague of his, I am giving you some land and I would like you to develop it, but on one condition. The people who occupy these houses must be from the finer classes. They must be wealthy. Catholics are not allowed to live in these houses. The working class are certainly not permitted to live in them. I mean, he had a very rich, snobby attitude, as you can tell, but he was that kind of person. And so that influence was there from the start, before the houses were even built. And Luke Gardner, the main architect, was of the same mindset. If you think about who you want your neighbours to be in a place like this. So that really influenced the construction and who lived there in this initial period. Now, Dublin was very much a medieval city in the decades leading up to this. I've talked about the fact that the streets were narrow, the buildings were old and decrepit a lot of the time. And so Luke Gardner, who was a very ambitious man, wanted to build something beautiful and wanted to make Dublin a far nicer and more aesthetically pleasing city, which cost money, of course. He wanted to make a name for himself and he wanted to make a profit from this. And a lot of the streets in Dublin, in Georgian Dublin, I'll give you some examples of them. Henrietta Street will be the first one, obviously. You've got Bolton Street, Grafton Street. You've got Duke Street, Henry Street, Mary Street, and the list goes on. And they're all names of people. They're all named after individuals. Luke Gardner said, well, on this plot of land, I've been given the funding by someone who I'm then going to name the street after. And I don't know if this is true or not. I can let you decide this for yourself. But the street outside, the street that we're on now, Henrietta Street, Luke Gardner said to his funder, will I name my street after yourself, sir? And he said, no, please, name it after my wife. And I'm sure it was a happy marriage if he said that. But the evidence for that is lacking, unfortunately. I think it's a funny story, but we don't have full proof of it. So the layout then and construction of Henrietta Street. North side Dublin at that stage needed a lot of these houses. It needed houses close to Dublin Castle for people working there. It needed to have streets that were straight, that were wide, that were even and orderly, not like the twisty old medieval streets of Dublin. And Gardner had an architectural vision as well. He wanted to build houses for the wealthy to show their status. The lords, the ladies, the top-ranking officers, the higher clergy of the Church of Ireland. They had their own estates outside Dublin, certainly. But they wanted to come to Henrietta Street to have a townhouse to live in, but to show people their ostentatious wealth. So they would have come here at the same time as well that there was an Irish Parliament in Dublin near the bottom of Grafton Street. So if we have a look at the timeline, it kind of stops and starts in relation to the building of the various houses because different architects became involved. They built different houses on the street. So outside you'll see that the streets have slightly different designs and styles between them. But at the same time there is still a similarity and a harmony between them, and a symmetry. Proportion is there, as with the Renaissance style of architecture. You've got those columns, those porticos and pediments and friezes sometimes, and we can see certainly even in this room some of these designs, especially the sash windows here. So those sash windows are a key part of Henrietta Street's house design, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And at the outset of this period, 1720, 1730, those early decades, these houses were purely for the very wealthy. But over time, the profile of who lived here changed. It became a legal enclave. It was where solicitors and barristers lived and worked nearby. I don't know if you know, at the top of the street here we have the King's Inns. So the King's Inns was actually built after Henrietta Street. But any questions so far? Yes?
Who was this Henrietta precisely? If it's true.
Okay, I'd rather give you the facts than the legends, but apparently it was the wife of the Duke of Grafton. That's according to what I've read on the subject. There are other stories and other rumours out there that I won't get into this evening, but you know yourself, sometimes you prefer the facts rather than the legends. Is that okay with you? Okay, anyone else? You all okay? So this is a picture of this fantastic street that we're on at the moment. And this is a house in the middle of the street. This is 14 Henrietta Street, where we are now. Have a look at some of the features here. We have three houses beside each other, 13, 14, 15. And they have the same width, more or less, maybe as, O'Connell Street. They're as wide as the houses on O'Connell Street. But also the street itself is as wide as parts of O'Connell Street. Apologies, the interpreter wants to clarify that. The three houses together would be the width of O'Connell Street. And you can see the little features at the top of the columns at number 14, number 13 here, they've got columns as well. And columns here in a slightly different design. So the architect was the same man. Luke Gardner was the builder. And if you have a look at the windows, they're of decreasing height as we go up the floors, and also there's a basement. And that's very much the style that we can see all throughout the street. We can see the fan lights as well on some of the doors. Here's an example. So these fan lights are a design feature of the time of Georgian architecture. They were a classical feature of architecture. So they derived from many, many years before then. Greek, Roman architecture, that was a feature brought back. And they're fantastic looking buildings, aren't they? And you can see what a great job has been done in restoring 14 Henrietta Street here. So just to talk about the facades, the outsides of the house, and then the insides, the interiors. So to talk about the front of the buildings, the facades, you can see that the doors and the windows are quite uniform looking. I might go back and forward between the pictures, if that's okay, if I don't mind going back and forth between slides. Okay. So we have our door here, we have our windows either side. our door in the middle with our Renaissance style columns. And this portico comes out from the level of the brick a little bit. And that's a really good example of these porticos we see on the street. The brickwork itself, you'll see very frequently in Henrietta Street. And in Georgian times, red brick was often used. Later on, you'll see some of the houses using yellow brick in this period. That's because it was cheaper. But in the Georgian period, red brick was the standard. You'll also see on the ground floor of these buildings, these steps up. Sometimes on the front, the ground floor level, you'll see some stone carvings and some rusticated floors as well. Don't worry about the term, but what it basically means, it's a particular kind of stone carving to make it look rougher, more rustic. So it's a carving on stone to give it that feel of being a little bit worn, a little bit used, rusticated. I've mentioned already, if we go back to it, the pediments here, the columns and the portico. And the builders and architects, when it came to the tops of these porticos, they'd often be decorated very elaborately with different cornices and so on. See the iron railings here at the side? Iron railings either side is another feature, symmetrical. Now it's not in this picture, but some of the Georgian houses would have metal footstops to wipe your shoes before you went in, because of course every single day in a city full of horses, you're stepping in some pretty nasty things. So this is a way to clean your shoes before you go in. The architects actually wanted to incorporate that into the building of the houses. And now to talk about right here, when you've come in downstairs into 14 Henrietta Street, I don't know if you've seen the grand staircase and noticed that sweeping staircase upwards. Now that's been restored. The original staircase unfortunately was sold, so it is a replacement one. But the fireplace is something, the fireplace we have in this room isn't the original, but it would have that same idea of this big, wide fireplace. So if you have a look in the middle there and how deep it is. So the width of your fireplace was very important in Georgian architecture. And you can also see that the ceilings are really high in this room, aren't they? So that height of the ceiling, very much a feature of this style of architecture. You've also got these cornices. This cornice and this other plasterwork here going around the inside corners at the top of the wall there at ceiling level. So really, this is incredibly skilled work, a lot of craftsmanship to make this. You've also got the sash windows. And the sash windows were really all about showing off. It was all about, we're looking outside at the beauty of our street, seeing people going by. Hello, yes, we're at home. Lords and ladies at our leisure. So this is the times that people were living in, and that's the function of that. It's really important to remember that each of these buildings in Henrietta Street is very different from the last. So you can see 13, 14, 15, 16 and so on. There is a uniformity, but at the same time, each building is distinct. And there are little features of each one that differ from its neighbours. And yet, this is, I mean, if we look at the list here of the architects and the builders of each of the houses, this particular house was built by Luke Gardner. You've also got Richard Castles. He was listed as, he's a very famous architect at the time during Georgian times, and he was also involved. So we can see that we've got these architects and builders involved. Okay, moved on. Now here we go. You can see three different kinds of columns here. And I'm going to give you just a little taste here of what makes these different from each other. And if you want a bit of exercise, I'm going to give you a bit of a task, if you would like to undertake it. Have a look after this talk on the street and the different columns in the porticos. And remember these 3 different types of column. So you've got your door, you've got your columns either side going up to the top of the portico. Have a look at the very top of those columns. What kind of design do you see? Because that differing type of design is, well, first of all, these elements at the top of the columns are called capitals. But there's different kinds of capitals. A plain capital means it's a Doric column, like this one here on the left. You see at the very top here, there's not much decoration. It goes up, it's very plain at the top. If you'll notice, Doric columns were supposed to be representative of masculinity. This is a Greek idea. Greek masculinity represented and symbolized in this kind of column. In the middle here in the picture, we have Ionic columns. And you'll see at the very top here an almost a scroll-like feature here in the capital. So if you can imagine a scroll being opened out, but if you then turn that upside down, that's what the capital in this Ionic column looks like. So that's a particular style that's meant to represent femininity, apparently. If you go back and have a look at this, you can't really see it in that drawing, to be honest, but maybe 14 Henrietta Street, where we are now, maybe if you have a look outside later on, have a look at the columns. Which is it? Is it Doric? Is it Ionic? We've also got a third kind, Corinthian. And these were very ornate at the top. The capitals had features of flowers and animals, and they were quite tall. You can see an example there. So very ornate, elaborate carvings at the top. And they were called Corinthian columns. So this is 2024, Henrietta Street, where we are now. And I'm sure some of you must be thinking that, you know, whatever about the architects, the builders, what about the people who lived here? And that's what I'll talk about right now. I don't know if any of you recognize this area here in the painting. Again, this is a James Malton piece. I'll let you know where this is. Here in this corner, it's now known as Parnell Square. At the time, it had a different name, and it was called Rutland Square. And there's a few other changes as well since. But I don't know if you know the Hugh Lane Gallery and where that is. So that is this building here. And these houses here, these Georgian houses, you can see are very similar to the ones in Henrietta Street, aren't they? So you can see, again, that symmetry, the Georgian architecture, the features are there in the columns here in this building, which is now gone here on the left, unfortunately. So again, these were the residences of the elite. Henrietta Street began life in the early 1720s. The houses were constructed bit by bit. It didn't all happen in the one phase. Different people were involved before, different architects, different builders. In the late 1750s, the street was complete. And Henrietta Street really took 30 years or so to build into what you see now. And this is all because of the Archbishop wanting rich people to live there. And for a while, the place was known as Primate's Hill because of that, because of the bishop's involvement. People knew that, oh, this is the street that the Archbishop built. This is where the really wealthy people, the real top, the creme de la creme in society live. It's a very different story now, of course, and in the coming decades. And it did influence urban planning elsewhere. So again, we've seen this painting here of Parnell Square as it is now. Henrietta Street was also very close to other areas like Dublin Castle and other areas where, like the King's Inns eventually, and other important areas for Dublin cultural and social life. And just to say again that 1795 is when King's Inns was finally built, and it was a good bit after Henrietta Street was finished, but it was very, very near for people who were in the legal profession who lived in Henrietta Street. Any questions? We all okay? Okay. So Henrietta Street, in Georgian times, is something that everyone talks about in terms of the aristocracy, the elite, the wealthiness of the people that lived here, the aristocratic nature of Henrietta Street life. However, what's really, there are lots of very important people that lived here. People would come here for social gatherings, people who were involved in the Irish Parliament, members of Parliament and so on would live here, socialise here. They would have grand parties and balls, and these would be very, very well attended. And these would go to other areas of Georgian Dublin too. In 1801, all this came crashing to a halt. It stopped quite abruptly. And the reason because of this is because the Irish Parliament had been there before. But this became a problem. In the late 18th century, the United States was founded. It became independent of Britain. It was no longer a colony. And this gave the politicians in London a bit of a fright, this development. Next thing you know, there's a French Revolution. Another fright for the politicians in London, and other rebellions around Europe at the same time, of course. So the government was on edge. And next thing you have the 1798 rebellion in Ireland. Oh, this is too close to home for us. In future, Irish politicians would come to Westminster, not Dublin. So the Irish Parliament was gone, just as the Scottish Parliament was gone before it. Great Britain and Ireland would have one Parliament in Westminster, and in 1801, the people who had been attached to that social scene of the politicians in Dublin pretty much left the capital. And if you want to know more about what happened here in Henrietta Street after that time, after 1801, please come to the museum, do a tour. There's a great selection of guided tours that we do during the day, all through the week. So it's a really fantastic program of events that we have if you want to know more. So that was the wealthy classes and the elites. What about the middle classes? Well, they weren't really there in the early days of Henrietta Street. They were at a remove. They couldn't afford these houses. But as the decades passed, again, the profile of who lived here changed. So again, you'll remember in the late 18th century, you had the establishment down the road of King's Inns, and that began a real change. This became a legal enclave. The people who lived here were barristers, solicitors, not so much the lords and ladies who left after 1801. You also had other people moving in. Artists, craftsmen, merchants, all these different people from different walks of life lived in Henrietta Street. When it comes to the working class then, no one really talks about them in relation to Henrietta Street. And why not? I'm going to talk about them tonight, I'll tell you that much. So the working classes, they were very fit people, I'll tell you that much. Can you imagine walking down all those stairs to the top floors of Henrietta Street buildings, day in, day out, cooking the dinner in the kitchen, bringing the shopping in from the ground floor level all the way up to your top floor apartment. But they were also very invisible people, in a way. Sometimes we do respect the lives of working classes that lived in this area before, but there's one book I'm reading at the moment that really brought this point home to me. It makes sense. Sometimes, we know about things at the moment like Garda vetting. There was no Garda vetting, there was no police force in Georgian Dublin. How do you know if you could trust your servants that you brought into your home? So servants would come and go in these big grand old houses for these rich families. Quite often some of them were honest servants, some of them were not, some of them were more criminal in orientation. It really varied. And there's so many different personalities and so many walks of life represented in the working classes that lived here. And they weren't all the same. We can't say that all the working class experiences were identical. One of the problems was that the working classes who lived in Henrietta Street were hugely dependent on the people who lived in these houses and owned them, the elite, the managers of the houses, the lords and the ladies, the masters of the houses. Otherwise, without them, how could they sleep? How could they eat? So there was a dependency culture. Any questions so far? Okay. And here's an example by way of an extract from a painting here. Remember the other picture that we saw of what was Capel Street at the time, going over the bridge, and you could see Parliament Street and the dome of City Hall in the background. This is from the same picture, the same overall painting, but this is a detail that I've cropped. And you can see that the detail really does show people from all walks of life. You've got this mother and her daughter here, that they could be middle class, we're not quite sure. But then we have these figures. We have this man here with his dog. We have had this lady with her young child. It looks like a young boy. We have some people there in the background as well, a man, a kind of a well-dressed man with his young son. And we have some military men there, some soldiers on horseback. All different kinds of people and backgrounds. So in 1729, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jonathan Swift, the writer from the early 18th century. I'm sure everyone's heard of Swift to some degree. He was actually a deafened man himself, would you believe? But he wrote a fantastic, or at least I think it's fantastic, absolutely amazing account. A satirical piece in 1729 that talked about this kind of, it's called A Modest Proposal. I don't know if you've ever heard of A Modest Proposal before. Some people have, some people haven't, which is fine. For those of you who don't know about this piece, it's a really good satire. So A Modest Proposal by Jonathan Swift talked about this satirical idea of how to address the overpopulation of Dublin. There are too many people living in the street. There are too many people in poverty. Why not purchase their children, feed these children until they're age 12 or so, and then eat them, use them as meat. This was a satirical piece. Of course, it wasn't serious. It was just making the point. We need to do something about this problem of homelessness in Dublin that was rife at the time. So after that point, I don't know if you know St. James's Hospital. Well, St. James's Hospital had a building in its grounds years ago that was founded, that was a foundling home. And that came about because of the shame that Swift's piece had brought around the people, the citizens of Dublin. They realized it was an issue, and so they set up this hospital to take in orphan children from the street. Any questions? Okay. So Henrietta Street, we have talked fairly in detail about. It being originally the home of the aristocracy, and then later on the middle class, the merchant class, and then the working class eventually in the changing profile over time. And Georgian Dublin, this happened as well. It's not just Henrietta Street. The city of Dublin also began to expand. More and more building took place. The city got bigger and bigger. All this building in Georgian Dublin took place in the 18th century, but this expansion continued. You saw Stephen's Green, Mountjoy Square. Now, in relation to Stephen's Green, as a green, it was being used for that purpose way, way before Georgian times. So it's slightly different story. But the houses surrounding the green, they're very much Georgian houses. And so you saw this, the social structure, the class system of the time in 18th century Dublin was that you don't mix with others outside of your own rank. You've got economic changes as well that happened as the decades passed after the 18th century. You had the penal laws that were in place as well through the 1700s. I don't know if you're aware of the penal laws. And the penal laws would have meant huge barriers to Catholics being part of social life, being part of political structures, getting involved in certain trades, and many other barriers. And so they had to navigate their way around that system. You also had the political context of Ireland changing hugely during the 18th century and afterwards. So you had a huge religious division in the 18th century, in the 19th century. You had very strict separation between people who were Catholic and people who were Protestant. Now, this wasn't, obviously there were subgroups within these major categories. There were different kinds of Protestants, and sometimes there were rivalries and segregation between those also. Irish society began to change as well during the 18th century. The population of Dublin as well began to expand, and that led to a big problem with housing and crime. It was a really big problem for law enforcement. What happens if you have a crime-ridden city and no police force, as there wasn't at the time? Now, there was a system called the Watchman system, or the Charlies, as they were also called. But really, they weren't trained professionals. The pay was very poor. And what you had in some areas was people getting very concerned about crime regardless. And so you kind of had neighbourhood watch systems developing. One particular area would agree to select someone to represent that district and watch out for criminal behaviour. You had magistrates and judges, yes, but aside from that, actual policemen on the ground, you didn't really see until a system was established in 1836. So crime was a big problem for Dublin. You had the Dublin Metropolitan Police being set up as well, and that was the name of Dublin's own police after 1836. Okay. So what I would do, if any of you are interested in further reading about Georgian Dublin, I'd heartily recommend these books that have far more detail and will tell you far more of the story that I'm trying to get at today. So The Best Address in Town is the first one, and the second is Georgian Dublin, The Forces That Shaped the City. Definitely recommend these two books. Okay, and that's it for me.